The disturbing case too dark for Netflix. The brothers who served more than whiskey to travelers. Some crimes are so heinous, even streaming platforms refuse to touch them. This true story of hospitality turned to horror remains buried in the darkest corners of criminal history. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. July 3, 1981, dawned bright and full of promise. Jessica Harmon, a 22-year-old aspiring teacher from Eugene, tossed her camping gear into the trunk of her yellow Ford Pinto with practiced ease. Her turquoise bracelet caught the morning light as she waved goodbye to her roommate, promising to share photos from her solo adventure to Silver Lake when she returned after the holiday weekend. The young woman had planned everything meticulously, a trait her mother Ellen had always admired. Mats marked with hiking trails were folded in the glove compartment, and a new camera sat ready on the passenger seat. Jessica's adventurous spirit had always pulled her toward Oregon's wilderness, a place where she felt most alive. By mid-afternoon, she pulled into the gravel lot of Donna's Diner, a roadside establishment just outside the logging town of Pinewood Creek. Several patrons remembered the bright-eyed girl with the peace sign keyring who ordered coffee and asked about the quickest route to Silver Lake. Marlene Foster, the waitress working the counter that day, would later recall Jessica checking her watch and mentioning she wanted to set up camp before sunset. "Drive careful on Highway 27, Marlene had warned. Those curves get tricky after dark." Jessica thanked her and left a generous tip before heading back to her vehicle. No one could have known this would be the last confirmed sighting of the college student. Her Pinto vanished somewhere along the winding forest road, as if the towering pines had simply swallowed both car and driver whole. When Jessica failed to return by Tuesday, Ellen Harmon reported her daughter missing. The mother's voice trembled as she described Jessica to the Pinewood Creek Sheriff's Department. Her determination, her dreams of becoming a teacher, the yellow automobile she drove. Within hours, search parties formed, combing the dense woods flanking Highway 27, checking ravines and riverbanks for any sign of the missing vehicle. Ellen refused to go home, sleeping instead in her car at the search headquarters, her eyes hollow with fear and hope. "My daughter wouldn't just disappear," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "Something happened to her." Flyers bearing Jessica's photograph appeared on telephone poles from Bend to Medford. Local radio stations broadcast descriptions of the missing woman and her automobile. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through underbrush, calling her name until their voices grew hoarse. But as days stretched into weeks, the case gradually cooled. The search parties dwindled. The media moved on to other stories. By autumn, Jessica Harmon had become another statistic, a missing person whose fate remained unknown. All that remained was the aching absence that hollowed out her mother's life, and a mystery that would haunt the region for decades to come. For nearly 15 years, Ellen Harmon refused to let her daughter's memory fade into the obscurity that often claims missing persons cases. In her modest home on Maple Street, Ellen transformed her living room into what locals came to call Jessica's command center. Maps of Oregon's forests covered the walls, red pins marking possible sightings, yellow string connecting theories, and Jessica's smiling graduation photo watching over it all. "My daughter is still out there," Ellen would insist, her voice growing more weathered but no less determined as the years passed. Every Tuesday morning, she arrived at the sheriff's office with a folder of new information, newspaper clippings about similar cases, statements from travelers who passed through Pinewood Creek, or theories she'd developed during sleepless nights. The candlelight vigils Ellen organized at the Pinewood Creek Methodist Church became a town ritual. At first, dozens attended, standing shoulder to shoulder in the glow of flickering flames. By the 10th anniversary, only a handful of loyal friends joined her, but Ellen never seemed to notice the dwindling numbers. Her letter-writing campaigns were legendary. She penned thousands of handwritten notes to state officials, journalists, and eventually true crime writers across Oregon. Each letter contained the same photograph of Jessica, bright-eyed and laughing, and ended with the same plea: "Someone knows something. Please help me find my daughter." Sheriff Robert Tanner, who held the position before Rodriguez, kept a special filing cabinet for Ellen's leads. "Mrs. Harmon is persistent," he'd tell new deputies, "and sometimes persistent people find what the rest of us miss." During the cold winter of 1994, Ellen's health began to fail. Still, she continued her search, even as neighbors brought casseroles and helped her up the steps to the church. When pneumonia confined her to bed, she dictated letters to her friend Martha from the Methodist Women's Group. Ellen passed away quietly in February 1995, her last words reportedly being, "Keep looking for my Jessie." The community, which had grown accustomed to her unwavering presence, mourned not just Ellen, but the energy that had kept Jessica's memory alive. With no immediate family to claim her estate, Ellen's home was eventually seized by the county. Workers found every surface covered with investigation materials, 14 years of meticulous research, boxed up and stored in the county records office, 3 filing cabinets of correspondence, 5 journals of possible leads, maps annotated in Ellen's increasingly shaky handwriting. Among the items was a sealed envelope addressed to whoever finds the truth, containing a silver locket with Jessica's picture and a simple note, "Thank you for bringing her home." The locket would remain in storage for 24 years before finding its way to the person Ellen had unknowingly been waiting for. In April 2019, the true crime landscape shifted when Skylar Reed, a 32-year-old podcaster with a growing following, released the first episode of Lost in the Pines. The series focused on Jessica Harmon's disappearance, a case that had faded from public memory outside of Pinewood Creek. Skylar's methodical approach and compassionate storytelling resonated with listeners nationwide. "There's something about the Crossroads Tavern that doesn't add up," Skylar's voice declared in the viral 3rd episode. She meticulously unpacked the inconsistencies in statements from Raymond and Edgar Blackwood, the reclusive brothers who had run the establishment for decades. Raymond had passed away 5 years earlier, but Edgar still lived on the outskirts of town, rarely seen except for occasional supply runs. The podcast unearthed long-buried rumors about travelers who felt uncomfortable at the tavern, particularly young women driving alone. Social media exploded with theories. Amateur sleuths created digital timelines, and suddenly Jessica's story was trending across platforms. Residents of Pinewood Creek found themselves divided, some embracing the renewed attention, others resenting the spotlight on old wounds. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez initially dismissed the podcast as sensationalism. A 20-year veteran of the department, she had her hands full with current cases. But as public pressure mounted and emails flooded her office, she recognized an opportunity. After 3 tense town meetings and countless calls to state officials, she secured a federal grant to establish the Pinewood Creek Cold Case Unit. "This isn't about a podcast," Sheriff Rodriguez announced at the press conference. "This is about justice delayed for too long." The sheriff's first move surprised many. Rather than assigning veteran deputies, she recruited Detective Marcus Wells, a recent transplant from Seattle's Homicide Division. Marcus had relocated to Oregon, seeking a quieter life after a high-profile serial killer case, but his reputation for methodical investigation made him perfect for the role. Tall and reserved, the detective brought fresh eyes unclouded by local politics. To complement his investigative skills, Rodriguez hired Dr. Leah Chen, a forensic scientist whose pioneering work with degraded evidence had helped solve cases decades old. The scientist's analytical mind and innovative techniques would prove crucial for evidence long considered compromised. "We're not making promises," Marcus told reporters as cameras flashed outside the courthouse, "but we're not giving up either." As the newly formed team settled into their makeshift office, Skylar Reed released her 6th episode, featuring an interview with a former patron who claimed to have seen Jessica's yellow Ford Pinto parked behind the tavern days after her disappearance. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community and gave the cold case unit their first tangible lead. The hunt for answers had officially begun, bridging the gap between Jessica's last known moments and the truth that had remained hidden for nearly 40 years. The fluorescent lights hummed above as Detective Marcus Wells and Dr. Leah Chen unpacked cardboard boxes in their makeshift headquarters. The Pinewood Creek Library had offered them the cramped room above the reference section, just enough space for 2 desks, a whiteboard, and stacks of evidence that hadn't seen daylight in decades. "Some of these files are practically disintegrating," Leah remarked, carefully separating yellowed police reports with gloved hands. The forensic scientist's methodical approach contrasted with Marcus's more intuitive style, but they shared an unwavering commitment to the case. Marcus nodded, pinning a faded photograph of Jessica Harmon to the wall. Her bright smile and confident posture seemed at odds with her tragic fate. "Ellen Harmon knew more than anyone gave her credit for," he said, opening one of the mother's notebooks. Inside were meticulous timelines, witness statements, and theories, all handwritten in neat, determined script. By the end of their first week, the walls transformed into a visual roadmap of the investigation. Red string connected locations along Highway 27, marking Jessica's last known route. Yellow pins indicated witness statements, while blue ones represented inconsistencies in the Blackwood brothers' accounts. "The original investigators barely looked at Raymond and Edgar Blackwood," Marcus observed, reviewing interview transcripts. 2 brief statements, no follow-ups, no property search. Leah glanced up from her computer. Small town, limited resources, and the brothers were fixtures in the community. Classic blind spot. She had been digitizing evidence, creating searchable databases from decades of paperwork. Her specialized scanner revealed fingerprints and stains invisible to the naked eye on Jessica's recovered journal pages. The detective spent his afternoons retracing steps, driving the winding forest roads where Jessica had vanished, and interviewing surviving witnesses. Many had aged into their 70s and 80s, memories clouded by time, but still holding crucial details. "The tavern always gave me the creeps," admitted a former truck driver, now living in a retirement community outside Bend. Raymond would watch the women who came in alone. Not like a businessman watching customers, like a hawk watching mice. Meanwhile, Leah discovered discrepancies in soil samples taken from the roadside where search parties had concentrated their efforts. "They were looking in the wrong area entirely," she told Sheriff Rodriguez during their weekly briefing. "The original search grid was based on flawed assumptions." As winter settled over Pinewood Creek, the cold case unit expanded their investigation. Marcus obtained property records showing unusual land purchases by the Blackwoods throughout the 70s, remote parcels with no development plans. Leah created 3-dimensional models of the tavern and surrounding area, identifying blind spots and potential evidence sites. Their determination was unwavering. Each morning, they would arrive before sunrise, thermos in hand, ready to piece together fragments of a puzzle nearly 4 decades old. The community watched with a mixture of hope and apprehension, wondering what secrets would finally surface from the darkness. The spring thaw of 2020 brought renewed hope to the Pinewood Creek Cold Case Unit. A group of community volunteers had organized weekend searches of the area surrounding the abandoned Crossroads Tavern, following leads generated by Skylar Reed's viral podcast. On a misty Saturday morning, Evelyn Winters, a retired librarian who had known Ellen Harmon, was combing through the overgrown brush behind the tavern when something caught her eye. Half buried in decades of pine needles and forest debris lay a small metal keychain, a peace sign, tarnished green with age. "It could be nothing," Marcus Wells said when the volunteer brought it to him, turning the object carefully in his latex-gloved hands. The detective had seen countless false leads in his career, but something about this weathered trinket made him pause. Dr. Leah Chen took the keychain to her makeshift lab above the county library. Under the bright lights of her magnification equipment, she noticed something the naked eye had missed. Tiny initials scratched into the metal. J.H. Jessica Harmon, she whispered, her analytical mind already calculating the odds. The forensic scientist immediately called Marcus, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "We need to get a warrant," Marcus told Sheriff Rodriguez later that afternoon, spreading photographs across her desk. The keychain matches the description in Ellen Harmon's notes, a peace sign Jessica always carried. Sheriff Rodriguez nodded grimly. "I'll call the judge myself." 3 days later, armed with a search warrant, Marcus and Leah led a team through the crumbling remains of the Crossroads Tavern. The main building had been picked clean by vandals over the years, but several outbuildings remained largely untouched, protected by superstition and the Blackwoods' lingering reputation. Behind the tavern stood a weathered garage, its windows boarded, its doors secured with a rusted padlock that had somehow survived decades of Oregon winters. Marcus examined the lock, noting how the surrounding wood showed no signs of tampering. Whatever was inside had remained undisturbed since the Blackwood brothers had sealed it. "Cut it," he instructed the county locksmith, stepping back as metal cutters snapped through the ancient lock. The door creaked open, releasing the stale air of secrets long confined. Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that swirled like ghosts disturbed from slumber. The team fell silent as their lights converged on an object covered by a faded tarp in the center of the concrete floor. "Jesus Christ," whispered one of the deputies, his voice barely audible. Marcus stepped forward, his heart pounding as he carefully lifted the edge of the canvas. What lay beneath would forever change Pinewood Creek and finally bring Jessica Harmon's story into the light. The air hung thick with dust as Marcus Wells pushed open the garage door, its hinges protesting after decades of disuse. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing what the detective had hoped and feared to find. There, beneath a weathered tarp, sat Jessica Harmon's yellow Ford Pinto, a time capsule from 1981. "Dr. Chen, you need to see this," Marcus called, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Leah Chen ducked under the low doorframe, her practiced movements betraying none of the emotion that flickered across her face when the light caught the vehicle's license plate. The forensic scientist immediately pulled on latex gloves, approaching the car with reverent precision. "It's been here the whole time," she whispered, brushing away cobwebs from the driver's side window. The glass was clouded with age, but through it they could make out the silhouette of a backpack on the passenger seat. The scent of old pine tar permeated the space, mingling with the musty odor of abandonment. The Pinto's tires had long since deflated, the vehicle settling into the dirt floor like it had grown roots. Time had stolen its shine, but there was no mistaking this was the car that had vanished along with its 22-year-old driver nearly 4 decades ago. Within hours, the quiet property behind the Crossroads Tavern transformed into a hive of activity. Sheriff Rodriguez established a secure perimeter while news vans lined the rural highway, reporters desperate for a glimpse of the discovery. The story of Jessica's found car spread through Pinewood Creek like wildfire, reigniting conversations long suppressed. Inside the makeshift evidence tent, Leah meticulously photographed and cataloged every item. Jessica's backpack yielded camping supplies, a dog-eared paperback, and a journal with entries stopping abruptly on July 3rd. Her camera, still loaded with undeveloped film, promised glimpses into her final hours. The car was wiped down, Leah noted, swabbing surfaces for DNA, but they missed spots under the steering wheel, the door handle recess. They were careful, but not careful enough. Meanwhile, Marcus compiled a timeline of the Blackwood brothers. Ownership and control of the property. Raymond and Edgar had run the tavern since the 70s, maintaining exclusive access to the outbuildings. Neither brother had ever allowed local law enforcement to thoroughly search the premises, a red flag that previous investigations had inexplicably overlooked. Ellen knew, Marcus said quietly, reviewing the mother's notes. She suspected the Blackwoods all along. As twilight fell over the pine trees, the cold case unit worked under portable lights, their shadows stretching across ground that had concealed secrets for far too long. For the first time since Jessica vanished, tangible evidence linked her disappearance to specific suspects. The discovery wasn't just a breakthrough. It was the beginning of justice for a young woman whose dreams had been buried beneath decades of silence. Detective Marcus Wells studied Edgar Blackwood across the metal table in the Pinewood Creek Sheriff's Office interrogation room. At 78, Edgar looked every bit the harmless elderly man, his shoulders hunched beneath a faded flannel shirt, arthritic fingers trembling as he sipped water from a paper cup. But Marcus had interviewed enough suspects to recognize the calculation behind those rheumy eyes. "I've told you everything I know," Edgar insisted, his voice quavering. "Raymond handled all the business matters at the tavern. I just kept the books and served drinks." Marcus leaned forward, sliding a photograph of Jessica Harmon across the table. "Then explain how her car ended up locked in your garage for 40 years. The elderly man's eyes darted to the door, then back to Marcus. What most would interpret as confusion, the detective recognized as panic. Edgar's left eye squinted slightly, the same tell he'd displayed when claiming he couldn't remember the summer of 1981. That must have been Raymond's doing," Edgar stammered. "My brother had his secrets." Dr. Leah Chen observed silently from behind the two-way mirror, noting each inconsistency in Edgar's story. She'd compiled a timeline of the brothers' movements based on receipts, bank records, and witness statements. The forensic scientist had already identified 3 different occasions when Edgar's alibis contradicted documented evidence. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez joined Leah in the observation room. "He's lying through his dentures," the sheriff muttered. Back in the interrogation room, Marcus methodically dismantled Edgar's narrative. "We have statements from former patrons that you were alone at the crossroads the night Jessica disappeared. Raymond was in Bend at a supplier meeting." Edgar's facade cracked slightly. "That's not. Raymond was always there when things happened." "Things?" Marcus pressed. The old man's hands shook more violently now. "Raymond had urges. He'd watched the women who came in alone, said they were asking for trouble, traveling by themselves on that highway." As the hours passed, Edgar's story shifted like quicksand. First, he knew nothing. Then, he was an unwilling witness. Finally, he admitted to helping Raymond clean up on multiple occasions, though he insisted his role was minimal. "I was afraid of him," Edgar whispered, tears welling. "You don't understand what Raymond was capable of." But Marcus did understand. The detective had seen the ledger, the methodical records, the careful planning. This wasn't the work of one dominant brother forcing another into compliance. This was partnership, a symbiotic relationship between 2 predators who had perfected their routine over decades. "Edgar," Marcus said quietly, "the soil samples from Jessica's trunk match exactly to 3 different locations on your property. Locations only you had access to after Raymond's death. You didn't just help, you continued." The elderly man's face hardened, his frailty suddenly less convincing. The mask had finally slipped. Marcus Wells followed a paper trail that led him to Rosedale Hospice in Portland. The facility's pale green walls and antiseptic smell reminded him of his grandmother's final days, but he pushed the memory aside. He was here for Jessica Harmon. Marlene Foster sat by the window, her thin fingers tracing patterns on a worn quilt. At 79, her body had grown frail, but her eyes still held a sharp clarity that Marcus recognized in seasoned witnesses. "I've been waiting for someone to ask," she said when Marcus introduced himself. "All these years, I kept wondering if what I saw mattered." The detective set up his digital recorder and pulled out a photograph of Jessica. Marlene's hands trembled as she touched the image. Such a pretty girl. She came in that morning for coffee, black, with just a touch of sugar. Said she was heading to Silver Lake for the weekend. Marlene paused, closing her eyes. She was wearing hiking boots. I remember thinking they looked new. Marcus nodded encouragingly. Did she speak with anyone at the diner? She kept to herself mostly, but Raymond Blackwood was there. Marlene's voice dropped to a whisper. He sat at the counter, drinking his usual. Didn't say much. But I caught him watching her. Not in the normal way men look at pretty girls. There was something calculating. The former waitress described how Jessica had paid her bill and headed for the door. That's when Raymond got up too. Said something to her outside. I couldn't hear what, but I saw her face through the window. Marlene's eyes filled with tears. She looked scared, detective, like someone had just told her something that shook her. She kept glancing back as she walked to her vehicle. Marcus leaned forward. Did you tell the police this in 1981? I tried. The deputy, can't remember his name now, he just said Raymond was a respected businessman. Said I was imagining things. She shook her head. After a while, I started to believe him. Thought maybe I had it wrong. The detective made careful notes about the deputy's dismissal, another thread in the tapestry of small-town complicity. One more thing, Marlene added, her voice steadier now. Jessica wasn't the only one. Over the years, I saw other travelers stop at Donna's before disappearing. Young people mostly. The Blackwood brothers would be friendly, offering directions or suggestions about local sites, places off the main road, if you understand me. Marcus understood perfectly. This wasn't just about Jessica anymore. The Crossroads Tavern had been a hunting ground, and Highway 27 a trap for unwary travelers. As he thanked Marlene and prepared to leave, she caught his sleeve. Make it right, detective, for all of them. Dr. Leah Chen sat cross-legged on the floor of the cold case unit office, surrounded by dusty cardboard boxes. These were Ellen Harmon's life's work, seized by the court after her death in 1995 and stored in the county archives for over 2 decades. The forensic scientist carefully lifted out folders, each one meticulously labeled with dates and locations. Marcus, you need to see this, she called out, her voice echoing in the small room above the library. Detective Marcus Wells looked up from his computer and joined her on the floor. Ellen's handwriting covered every page, neat and determined, just like the woman herself had been. There were hundreds of letters to officials, newspaper clippings, and most importantly, detailed timelines annotated with her own observations. She was building a case, Marcus whispered, leafing through a folder labeled Blackwood Inconsistencies. All these years, we thought she was just a grieving mother. Ellen had documented every statement the Blackwood brothers had made to police, highlighting contradictions that the original investigators had missed. In one note, she'd written, Raymond claims he closed the tavern at 9 p.m., but 3 separate witnesses saw his truck on Highway 27 after 11 the night Jessica disappeared. The detective whistled softly. The original deputies never cross-referenced these statements. Either they were incompetent or someone was protecting the Blackwoods, Leah finished, pulling out a faded photograph of Raymond Blackwood shaking hands with the former sheriff at a town fundraiser. As they dug deeper, they found Ellen's handwritten timeline of Jessica's last known movements. She had meticulously documented her daughter's planned route, gas purchases, and the weather conditions that day. Most crucially, she'd noted that Edgar Blackwood had sworn in his statement that he was in Bend visiting a supplier when Jessica vanished. But Ellen had found a receipt showing he'd purchased cigarettes at Donna's Diner just 30 minutes after Jessica was there. She knew, Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. Ellen knew they were involved, but nobody would listen. Leah carefully arranged the papers on their evidence board. The original investigation was sloppy. Small-town connections, inexperienced deputies, and a mother who wouldn't give up, Marcus added, pinning up Ellen's annotated map of the area surrounding the Crossroads Tavern. She even marked potential search areas we never checked. Sheriff Rodriguez entered the office, taking in the expanded evidence wall. What have you found? Marcus handed her Ellen's timeline. We've been looking at this all wrong. Ellen Harmon wasn't just preserving her daughter's memory. She was building a case against the Blackwoods. And from what we're seeing, she was right all along. The sheriff nodded slowly. Then let's finish what she started. ... Leah Chen stared at the results on her computer screen, her eyes widening. The soil composition from Jessica Harmon's vehicle trunk matched samples taken from the wooded area behind the Crossroads Tavern with 98% certainty. Organic matter, mineral content, even microscopic pine needles, all identical. Marcus, you need to see this, she called out. Her voice steady despite the gravity of what she'd discovered. Detective Marcus Wells leaned over her shoulder. Studying the charts and graphs, the forensic scientist pointed to the matching soil profiles, explaining how decades-old evidence could still tell a story. They moved her, Marcus whispered, piecing together the scenario. Stored the car in that garage, but buried her somewhere on the property. Leah nodded. The soil patterns suggest disturbance, not natural erosion. Someone dug into that earth, then covered it back up in a hurry. The detective straightened, already reaching for his phone. I'm calling Rodriguez. We need another warrant, more comprehensive this time. Within 24 hours, Sheriff Diane Rodriguez had secured the necessary paperwork. The cold case unit assembled a team including cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar specialists, and forensic anthropologists from the State University. Yellow crime scene tapes surrounded the perimeter of the tavern grounds as the team methodically sectioned the area into grids. The old building stood silent witness to their work, its weathered boards and broken windows like a guilty conscience made manifest. By mid-afternoon, one of the dogs alerted near a cluster of pine trees approximately 70 yards behind the tavern. The animal's behavior changed dramatically, whining, circling, pawing at the ground with increasing urgency. Mark it, Marcus called, his voice carrying across the search area. The radar team moved in next, rolling their equipment over the suspicious patch of ground. The operator's face grew grim as he studied the readout. We've got an anomaly, approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet deep. Marcus felt a chill despite the warm Oregon sun. After nearly 40 years, Jessica might finally be coming home. The excavation proceeded with painstaking care, each layer of soil removed and cataloged under Leah's watchful eye. 4 hours into the dig, a technician's trowel struck something solid. Not rock, but fabric. Stop, Leah commanded, dropping to her knees beside the pit. With delicate brushes and tools, she worked to expose what lay beneath. The unmistakable shape of human remains. Marcus stepped back, removing his hat in a gesture of respect. He thought of Ellen Harmon, who had died never knowing what happened to her daughter. He thought of the boxes of notes she'd left behind, a mother's desperate search now vindicated. The detective looked toward the abandoned tavern where Edgar Blackwood and his brother had served drinks for decades, hiding their terrible secret in plain sight. "We've got you now," he murmured. The forensic team worked methodically beneath the towering pines, their shovels breaking through decades of compacted soil and fallen needles. Dr. Leah Chen supervised every movement, ensuring that each layer was properly documented and preserved. 3 days into the excavation, a technician's tool struck something solid. Not a rock, but something with give. "Stop," Leah called out, dropping to her knees. With delicate brushes and careful hands, they revealed what everyone had feared, but expected. Human remains. Marcus Wells stood at the edge of the site, his face grim as he watched the team uncover what remained of Jessica Harmon. The skeleton lay in an unnatural position, suggesting a hasty burial. But it was the flash of turquoise that caught everyone's attention. A bracelet still circling the wrist bone, its beads faded but intact. "Ellen described this bracelet in her notes," Marcus said quietly, recalling the detailed descriptions the mother had recorded about her daughter's possessions. Jessica never took it off. The discovery sent ripples through the small Oregon town. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez established a perimeter around the Crossroads Tavern, keeping curious onlookers and media at bay while the team completed their work. The remains were carefully exhumed and transported to the county medical examiner's office, where DNA testing would later confirm what they already knew. Jessica had been buried behind the tavern for nearly 40 years. For the residents of Pinewood Creek, the revelation was devastating. Many had patronized the establishment while the Blackwood brothers served drinks behind the counter, never suspecting the horror concealed just yards away. Some recalled Raymond Blackwood's odd habit of watching young women through the tavern windows, while others remembered Edgar's nervous demeanor whenever law enforcement stopped by. "I used to park my car right next to where they found her," whispered an elderly man at the town's impromptu gathering at the Methodist church. "All those years, I was that close." The turquoise bracelet became a symbol of both tragedy and justice. Dr. Madio. Some time and summer memories about this someone's final moment, carried in the memory bank. Chen preserved it as evidence, photographing it from every angle before carefully cleaning it for DNA analysis. The jewelry yielded skin cells trapped between the beads, not Jessica's, but matching to samples taken from Edgar Blackwood's home. As night fell over the excavation site, Marcus stood alone among the pines. The wind bent the branches above him, creating eerie whispers that seemed to echo with secrets long buried. He thought about Ellen Harmon, who had died never knowing her daughter lay less than 15 miles from their home. "We found her," he said softly to the empty forest. "You can rest now, both of you." The news of Jessica Harmon's discovery spread through Pinewood Creek like wildfire. Within hours, the quiet town transformed into a community in mourning. Residents who had lived with the mystery for decades now faced the horrifying reality that evil had existed in their midst all along. At the Pinewood Creek Methodist Church, Pastor Williams organized an impromptu vigil that drew over 300 people. Candles flickered in trembling hands as former classmates of Jessica, now middle-aged parents themselves, shared memories of the bright, adventurous young woman they once knew. "She wanted to teach children about nature," sobbed Martha Jenkins, who had shared a dorm with Jessica at college. "Now our children are learning about her tragedy instead." Outside the cordoned-off Crossroads Tavern, a makeshift memorial grew by the hour. Turquoise bracelets, similar to the one found with Jessica's remains, were tied to the police tape alongside faded photographs and handwritten notes. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez stationed deputies at the site, both to preserve evidence and to manage the growing crowd of mourners and curious onlookers. The county officials wasted no time in seizing the property, padlocking the doors of the establishment that had harbored such terrible secrets. The weathered wooden sign that had welcomed travelers for decades was removed, though its shadow remained visible on the sun-bleached siding. National media descended upon the town like vultures. News vans lined Main Street, and reporters cornered longtime residents with uncomfortable questions about how the Blackwood brothers had operated in plain sight for so long. The spotlight exposed uncomfortable truths about small-town dynamics, the unspoken agreements, the averted gazes, the whispered warnings that never reached official reports. "We knew something wasn't right about those men," admitted Gerald Thornton, a retired logger who had frequented the tavern in the 80s. "But nobody wanted to speak ill without proof. That's just how things were done here." Marcus Wells observed the community's reaction with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The detective understood that justice often came with collateral damage, the shattering of a town's self-image, the painful questioning of collective choices. He watched as neighbors who had greeted each other warmly for years now exchanged suspicious glances, wondering who else might have known something and stayed silent. Dr. Leah Chen worked tirelessly in her makeshift lab, processing evidence while the town processed grief. The forensic scientist remained focused on the scientific truth, while all around her, social truths were being painfully reconstructed. For Pinewood Creek, a community once defined by its picturesque simplicity and small-town values, the revelation forced a reckoning with its shadow self. A place where silence had enabled predators and where loyalty had been tragically misplaced. The fluorescent lights of the interrogation room cast harsh shadows across Edgar Blackwood's weathered face. After 48 hours of questioning, the 77-year-old tavern owner finally broke down. His hands trembled as he signed the confession, admitting his involvement in Jessica Harmon's death, while Detective Marcus Wells watched with a carefully neutral expression. "Raymond was always the one in charge," Edgar whispered, his voice cracking. "That night, when the girl stopped for directions, my brother saw something in her that set him off. I just wanted her to leave, but Ray..." He trailed off, staring at the wall, as if seeing ghosts. The elderly man described how Raymond had followed Jessica's yellow Pinto down Highway 27, forcing her off the road. Edgar claimed he'd only helped move the vehicle afterward, terrified of his older brother's rage if he refused. "You could have come forward," Marcus said, sliding a photograph of Ellen Harmon across the table. "Her mother spent 15 years searching." Edgar's eyes welled with tears. "You don't understand what Ray was capable of. When he got angry, the old man rolled up his sleeve, revealing ancient cigarette burns tracking up his forearm. He'd been hurting people since we were kids. I was just trying to survive." Dr. Leah Chen observed from behind the two-way mirror, taking meticulous notes. The forensic scientist had expected this. The shifting of blame to the deceased brother, the portrayal of himself as another victim. Classic perpetrator behavior. Yet the physical evidence supported parts of his story. Raymond's fingerprints dominated the crime scene, while Edgar's were fewer, consistent with a secondary role. Back in the cold case unit office, Marcus pinned Edgar's signed statement to their evidence board. "He's minimizing his involvement," he told Sheriff Rodriguez, who stood with arms crossed, reviewing the confession. "But we've got enough to close Jessica's case." The sheriff nodded grimly. Ellen Harmon can finally rest in peace. "There's something else," Leah interjected, reviewing her notes. During the final hour of questioning, Edgar mentioned the others before catching himself. When pressed, he claimed it was just confused rambling, but his heart rate spiked on the monitor. Marcus exchanged a troubled look with his colleague. "You think Jessica wasn't their first? Or their last?" Leah replied quietly. That night, Sheriff Rodriguez held a press conference on the courthouse steps. Camera flashes illuminated her face as she announced the resolution of the Harmon case. Behind her, Marcus and Leah stood solemnly, knowing their work was far from over. In his cell, Edgar Blackwood sat alone, staring at the wall. The confession had unburdened him of one secret, but his haunted eyes suggested many more remained buried, both figuratively and literally, in the shadow of the Crossroads Tavern. The call came at 3 in the morning. Marcus Wells fumbled for his smartphone, his eyes still heavy with sleep. The night nurse at Pinewood Creek Memorial Hospital spoke in hushed tones. Edgar Blackwood was dying and asking for him by name. When Marcus arrived, Edgar lay propped against pillows, his skin the color of old parchment. The once intimidating tavern owner had withered to a husk, tubes snaking from his arms, the steady beep of monitors marking what little time he had left. "Detective," Edgar whispered, his voice barely audible over the medical equipment. "There's something you need to know before I go." Marcus pulled a chair close, setting his digital recorder on the bedside table. Edgar's confession about Jessica Harmon had closed one case, but the detective had always suspected there was more. "Raymond kept records," Edgar said, trembling fingers plucking at the hospital blanket. "My brother was meticulous, always proud of his work." The old man described a leather-bound ledger hidden beneath a specific floorboard in the tavern's back office, the third plank from the eastern wall, marked with a small notch. Edgar's eyes filled with tears as he admitted that Raymond had documented everything: dates, locations, even trinkets taken as souvenirs. 15, he whispered. Maybe more. I lost count. By dawn, Marcus had secured an emergency warrant. He and Dr. Leah Chen pried up the weathered floorboard exactly where Edgar had indicated. The forensic scientist wore latex gloves as she carefully extracted a dust-covered book, its pages yellowed with age. Inside, they found neat handwriting, Raymond's obsessive record-keeping laid bare. Each entry followed the same pattern: initials, date, brief physical description, and coded references to locations in the surrounding forests. Small symbols, circles, triangles, stars, appeared next to some names, their meaning unclear but ominous. My God, Leah breathed, her analytical mind already mapping patterns. This goes back to 1978. The cold case unit worked through the night, cross-referencing the cryptic entries with missing persons reports from the Pacific Northwest. By morning, they had matched 7 sets of initials to real people, travelers who had vanished along Highway 27 over the years. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez stared at the evidence wall, her face grim. "We're not dealing with a murder anymore," she said. "We're looking at serial predators who operated for decades right under our noses." The quiet logging town of Pinewood Creek had harbored monsters in plain sight. The Crossroads Tavern, once just a roadside establishment serving drinks to weary travelers, now revealed itself as something far more sinister, a hunting ground where the Blackwood brothers had selected, stalked, and documented their victims with chilling precision. For Marcus and Leah, Jessica Harmon's case had just become the tip of a very dark iceberg. The ledger became the Rosetta Stone of the investigation. Marcus Wells and Dr. Leah Chen spent countless nights in their cramped office above the county library, meticulously cross-referencing Edgar Blackwood's cryptic entries with decades of missing persons reports. The coded initials, dates, and locations gradually formed a horrifying pattern that stretched far beyond Jessica Harmon's case. "I think we've identified another victim," Leah announced one morning, sliding a file across the desk. Initials MT match a Melanie Thompson, 22, reported missing in October 1979. She was hitchhiking to Portland. The detective nodded grimly, pinning another photo to their ever-expanding wall of victims. Each face represented someone who had vanished along that lonely stretch of Highway 27. A young couple on their honeymoon, 3 teenage runaways, a traveling salesman, and others who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez secured additional funding as the case expanded, allowing the team to employ ground-penetrating radar at locations marked in the ledger. The technology revealed disturbing anomalies beneath the forest floor, rectangular disturbances in the soil that matched the dimensions of human graves. The Blackwoods were methodical, Marcus explained during a tense briefing with state officials. They targeted vulnerable travelers, people passing through, those who wouldn't be immediately missed in Pinewood Creek. The team's findings sent ripples across the Pacific Northwest. News outlets that had initially dismissed Skylar Reid's podcast as sensationalism now clamored for interviews. The forensic scientist found herself explaining complex DNA analysis on national morning shows, while her colleague fielded calls from law enforcement agencies across 3 states. For the families of the missing, the discoveries brought a bittersweet mixture of grief and relief. In a small ceremony at the Methodist Church, parents who had spent decades wondering about their children's fates embraced one another, united by a shared tragedy and the closure they'd finally received. "My daughter left for a weekend trip in 1982, an elderly woman told Marcus, clutching a faded photograph. "I've been waiting 40 years to know what happened to her. Thank you for not giving up." Despite their growing public profile, the detective and forensic expert remained focused on the evidence. They worked tirelessly, knowing that each entry in the ledger represented someone's child, sibling, or parent, someone who deserved to be found and remembered. As the death toll climbed to 15 confirmed victims, Pinewood Creek's darkest secret was fully exposed. The Crossroads Tavern, once just another roadside establishment, had been the hunting ground for what would become known as Oregon's deadliest serial killers, the brothers who served more than whiskey to travelers on Highway 27. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday morning when Marcus Wells received an unexpected call from the Pine Ridge Retirement Home. A former deputy named Harold Jennings, now in his 80s and suffering from congestive heart failure, wanted to speak about the Blackwood case before it was too late. Marcus found Harold propped up in bed, oxygen tubes snaking across his withered face. The old man's hands trembled as he confessed to accepting $500 from Raymond Blackwood in 1981 to mark the garage behind the Crossroads Tavern as inspected and clear in official reports. "I knew something wasn't right," Harold whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of medical equipment. Raymond said it was just about storing some untaxed liquor. But when Jessica went missing, he paused, fighting tears. "I suspected, but I was too much of a coward to come forward." The detective listened without judgment as the former lawman described how Raymond had cultivated relationships with several officers, offering free drinks and occasional cash for small favors. What began as minor corruption had enabled something far more sinister, creating blind spots in the investigation that allowed Jessica's car to remain hidden for decades. Dr. Leah Chen immediately began cross-referencing the falsified inspection reports with the dates in the secret ledger. The correlation was undeniable. Each time a victim disappeared, Raymond had ensured the property wouldn't be thoroughly searched. "This isn't just about two brothers anymore," Leah told Marcus as they updated their evidence board. The system itself failed these victims. When Sheriff Diane Rodriguez was briefed on Harold's confession, her face hardened with resolve. As the first female sheriff in county history, she had inherited a department with deep-rooted problems. Now, with an election just months away and opponents calling the Blackwood case a stain on local law enforcement, she faced her greatest challenge. At a tense press conference outside the county courthouse, Rodriguez stood before a crowd of reporters and community members. "The corruption that allowed these crimes to continue stops today," she announced, unveiling a comprehensive reform plan that included external oversight, mandatory ethics training, and a civilian review board. For the families of the victims, Harold's confession brought mixed emotions. Relief that the truth was finally emerging, but rage that justice had been delayed by those sworn to uphold it. Jessica's childhood friends, now middle-aged parents themselves, demanded accountability from the entire department. As Marcus left the retirement home, Harold grasped his wrist with surprising strength. "Find them all," the old man pleaded. "Don't let anyone else be forgotten." The detective nodded, knowing that the investigation had entered a new phase, one that would examine not just the monsters who preyed on the innocent, but the broken systems that had protected them for far too long. Dr. Leah Chen sat hunched over the weathered ledger, her eyes straining in the fluorescent light of the cold case unit's office. The coded entries had initially seemed impenetrable, but after weeks of analysis, patterns were emerging that chilled her to the bone. "Marcus, look at this," she called to Detective Wells, who was pinning location markers on a large topographical map. "The Blackwoods weren't just opportunistic killers. There's a system here." The forensic scientist pointed to recurring symbols next to victims' initials, crescents, crosses, and triangular markings that corresponded to lunar phases and seasonal changes. The brothers had selected burial sites with methodical precision, creating a grotesque constellation across the Pinewood Creek forests. "They were following some kind of ritual," Marcus said, his voice low. Raymond was the architect, but Edgar kept the records. Classic dominant-submissive dynamic. When Sheriff Diane Rodriguez entered with rolled-up construction plans, her expression was grave. "Highway Department just confirmed. The expansion project breaks ground in 3 weeks. Right through these coordinates." She jabbed a finger at the map, directly over 5 suspected burial sites. The team worked through the night, cross-referencing the ledger's cryptic notations with soil composition reports and historical weather data. By dawn, they had identified 15 potential locations where victims might be buried, 7 directly in the path of the planned highway. "We need to move now," Marcus insisted during an emergency meeting with county officials. "These aren't just crime scenes. They're someone's daughter, someone's son." Within 48 hours, the cold case unit had assembled a remarkable operation. Construction crews, initially frustrated by the delay, became solemn allies when they understood what was at stake. Archaeologists from Portland State University volunteered equipment and expertise. Even former skeptics from the town council arrived with coffee and sandwiches for the search teams. At each site, Dr. Chen documented the brothers' macabre signatures, small objects left with the victims that matched entries in the ledger. A silver thimble, a broken watch, a child's toy soldier. Each item, seemingly random, had been carefully recorded alongside the victims' initials. "They wanted to remember," Leah explained to Marcus as they supervised the careful excavation of the third site. "This wasn't just killing, it was collection." The most disturbing discovery came at the 5th site, where they found a carefully arranged circle of pine cones surrounding the remains. The ledger had marked this victim with a special symbol, suggesting Raymond had considered this murder particularly significant. Sheriff Rodriguez stood at the edge of the site, watching as forensic technicians gently brushed soil from bone. "All these years," she whispered, "people drove past the tavern, never knowing what the ground beneath them held. The highway would eventually be built, but with a modified route that preserved the dignity of those who had been silenced for too long." The cold case unit's race against time had given the victims one final justice: the right to be found. For 2 years after Edgar Blackwood's deathbed confession, the forensic team led by Dr. Leah Chen worked methodically through the cryptic ledger entries. Each code, each set of initials, represented not just evidence, but a person, someone's child, sibling, or spouse, who had vanished without explanation. Using cutting-edge DNA analysis techniques and cross-referencing with missing persons databases across multiple states, they gradually put names to the remains. "We've identified the remains from Site 7, Leah announced one autumn morning, her usually composed demeanor softened by emotion. Alicia Donovan, 24, reported missing in 1979 while traveling to Seattle. Marcus Wells maintained a wall of photographs in their office, faces of the lost, slowly moving from unidentified to confirmed. Each identification brought a mixture of devastation and closure to families who had spent decades wondering. Parents now in their 70s and 80s made the pilgrimage to Pinewood Creek, some barely strong enough to travel, but determined to bring their children home. The Chen Wells identification protocol became a case study in forensic journals. Their meticulous work recovered histories that might otherwise have remained buried forever. A young couple from California vanished during their honeymoon. A college student hitchhiking to a music festival. A traveling salesman whose company eventually declared him abandoned his position. Sheriff Rodriguez coordinated with authorities across 3 states, arranging for proper burial services and transportation of remains. The small town's resources were stretched thin, but community members opened their homes to visiting families, sharing in both grief and relief. Jessica would have wanted to help these families, Ellen Harmon had written in her notes years earlier, as if foreseeing this moment of collective healing. The Pinewood Creek Methodist Church, where Ellen had once held candlelight vigils, became a gathering place for memorial services. Pastor Wilson, though new to the congregation, embraced his role in the healing process, offering comfort without easy answers. When spring arrived, the town council unanimously approved the establishment of the Jessica Harmon Memorial Scholarship for aspiring teachers. The first recipient, a quiet, determined girl from the local high school, accepted the award with tears in her eyes, promising to carry forward Jessica's unfulfilled dream. "We can't change what happened," Skylar Reed said in the final episode of her podcast series, "But we can change how we remember." Slowly, Pinewood Creek began to forge a new identity, not as the site of unspeakable crimes, but as a community that refused to let silence win. The 12 families, once strangers united only by tragedy, formed lasting bonds with each other and with the town that had finally given them answers. Truth, no matter how painful, had become the foundation for remembrance and eventually for hope. The bulldozers arrived at dawn on a crisp spring morning in 2023. The Crossroads Tavern, that weathered structure of timber and stone that had stood sentinel over Highway 27 for nearly 60 years, was finally coming down. Residents of Pinewood Creek gathered behind safety barriers, some with cameras, others simply watching in solemn silence as the walls that had harbored so many secrets crumbled into dust. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez stood with her arms crossed, watching as the last remnants of the Blackwood legacy disappeared. The demolition had been her initiative, pushed through the county council despite budget concerns. Some places can't be cleansed, she had argued during the heated town meeting. Some buildings hold too much darkness. In the weeks that followed, volunteers transformed the site. Where the tavern's foundation had once stood, landscapers planted a circle of young pine saplings. At the center, a simple granite monument listed the names of all 16 victims, Jessica Harmon's name etched first, followed by the others who had been identified through Marcus and Leah's tireless work. On dedication day, over 200 people gathered at the Memorial Garden. Former classmates of Jessica, now in their 60s, wore turquoise bracelets matching the one that had helped identify her remains. Ellen Harmon's closest friends brought wildflowers and photographs. The wind rustled through the young pines, creating a whispered soundtrack to the ceremony. Marcus Wells stood slightly apart from the crowd, his expression contemplative as he watched Dr. Chen place a small stone on the monument, a forensic scientist's tribute to victims she had come to know through science and evidence. The detective had aged visibly during the 3-year investigation. Gray now peppered his temples, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. "I never expected to end up here," he confided to Leah as they walked the perimeter of the garden after the ceremony. "When I transferred from Seattle, I thought I was taking a quiet post before retirement." The scientist smiled, adjusting her glasses. "Instead, you helped bring justice to 16 families and changed an entire community." For Sheriff Rodriguez, the memorial represented both closure and a new beginning. Her department had been transformed, new protocols implemented, old case files digitized, and a permanent cold case unit established with federal funding. The corruption that had allowed the Blackwoods to operate unchecked for decades had been rooted out. As twilight fell over the Memorial Garden, the last visitors departed. Small solar lights illuminated the pathway around the monument, ensuring that darkness would never again conceal what happened here. The Crossroads Tavern was gone, but its legacy had been transformed, from a place of horror to a space for remembrance and healing. For Pinewood Creek, it marked the end of a chapter written in silence and fear, and the beginning of one founded on truth and reconciliation. Jessica Harmon's story, once whispered in hushed tones throughout Pinewood Creek, has transformed into a powerful testament to perseverance. The Memorial Garden, now standing where the Crossroads Tavern once cast its shadow, has become a place of reflection rather than fear. 16 families found closure through the tireless efforts of Detective Marcus Wells and Dr. Leah Chen, whose partnership proved that even decades-old wounds could heal with the right combination of forensic science and human determination. The Jessica Harmon Scholarship now supports 4 students annually from Pinewood Creek High School who wish to pursue teaching careers. Ellen would have been proud to see her daughter's dream living on through others, her years of meticulous documentation finally vindicated. The boxes of notes that once filled her living room have been preserved in the county archives, a testament to a mother's unwavering love. Sheriff Diane Rodriguez implemented sweeping reforms within her department, establishing one of Oregon's most respected cold case units. The sheriff often credits the case with redefining her approach to leadership and community trust. Marcus and Leah still consult on difficult cases, though both have moved on to new challenges. He to train the next generation of detectives, she to develop advanced forensic techniques at the State Crime Lab. The retired deputy who confessed to accepting Raymond Blackwood's bribes spent his final years volunteering with missing persons organizations, his redemption incomplete but earnest. Marlene Foster passed away peacefully last year, having lived long enough to see justice served for the young woman whose coffee order she remembered 4 decades later. Skylar Reed's podcast, Lost in the Pines, won national awards and inspired similar investigations across the country. The media attention brought both healing and discomfort to Pinewood Creek, forcing the community to confront its complicity in maintaining silence for so long. Each spring, residents gather at the Memorial Garden to honor not just Jessica, but all 16 victims identified through the investigation. Families travel from across the Pacific Northwest, placing turquoise bracelets, Jessica's signature accessory, on the central monument. The wind through the young pine trees seems to whisper their names. Edgar Blackwood died in prison, his confession incomplete, but sufficient to bring closure to many families. The secret ledger he revealed has become a crucial piece of evidence in understanding how predators operate in rural communities, studied by criminologists nationwide. As Pinewood Creek looks toward the future, its identity is no longer defined by tragedy, but by resilience. The town that once harbored darkness now stands as a model for confronting painful truths. Jessica's story teaches us that justice, however delayed, remains essential, and that memory, when properly honored, can transform even the deepest wounds into sources of strength, healing, and profound community change.